their military budgets, which they really cannot afford to do, given the vast amount of inequality, the debt, the poverty in these regions. Second are the new military bases and logistics agreements with the US and by proxy with NATO. Then there's more interventions by the US directly and by NATO. For example, the coup in Pakistan, where it's been very clearly shown that the Prime Minister Imran Khan was removed and the Pakistani military is back in the driving seat in the Pakistan government. So the hollowing out of democracies in all these regions because of this increase in militarization, the neglect of climate, of inequality, of poverty, and on the other hand, the increase of the national security state, increased threat perceptions, and the use of NATO by our own comprador elites and countries who are getting divided on old fissures that can be identity, race, caste, or ethnicity, and finding less funding for social expenditures and climate finance. So finally, militarization, as NATO is promoting, it also encourages inter and intrastate, force as a measure of inter and intrastate relations that trickles down to privileging force in intercommunity and interpersonal relations, between gender relations, dividing feminist and women's movements as more and more women are co-opted in this military-industrial nationalist complex. So friends, no to NATO and our support to the Washington Conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anu. You raised many issues, I think. By the way, NATO is not only in breach with Article 6, limiting its geographic spectrum, but also with Article 5, since it started to intervene outside the treaty area, which is not the purpose of NATO, let's say, in Article 5 as a defense organization. But very important also, I think, what you said about the steering group, as you called it, or somebody else called it, steering group, the G7 as the most advanced democracies, thinking about what the US did on an international level in supporting democracies. I say it in a cynical way. And then, of course, the policy of confrontation, again, in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia, through alliances, a military buildup by the US and alliances with the US, and increase the military budgets, military bases, and so on. We got a lot of issues from your part. So that's, I think we got now, the three speakers, a lot of input for discussion, or maybe first questions. So everybody, maybe to raise your hand, there is a button for that. And also, please, since we are like 63 people, limit your intervention, make it very short so that everybody has the opportunity to speak. So who would like to start? Okay, Zulkovic. Please, your micro. You're still muted. Okay, maybe I give first the floor to Rainer, and meanwhile you can try to switch on the mic. Oh, it's okay. Zul, yeah. We can't hear you. Sorry, we can't hear you. You're not muted, but we have no sound. Okay, maybe you should first try to solve the problem. Rainer, I give the floor to you.
You first, thanks to the three speakers, which are really raising the main point. I only want to add one point. I think we also should have in mind the militarization of Arctic and Antarctic, which by the climate change is a new area of militarization in the world. And NATO is doing a lot in many parts of the world to start these to militarize these areas, which I think is a new kind of danger for many, many issues. So please let us have this in mind when we are discussing about the Washington summit. We know that they have a discussion about the Arctic at the last summit in Vilnius, and I think they will continue militarize this area.
Okay, thank you, Rainer. Zul, I don't know, can you try again to speak now? It doesn't work. Okay, maybe you can write your question in the chat if it's just a question. Okay, Mike Ferner.
Hello.
Hello.
I just wanted to say how glad I am to be here with you, and thanks to David Swanson for the invitation to this meeting. And I just briefly want to let you know that Veterans for Peace, along with World Beyond War and Code Pink, and I'm not sure who all else, but we're heading up a effort to have a walk across the United States, starting from California and going to Washington, D.C., which will end a couple of days before the NATO summit. So as we build participation in that walk, we'll obviously be telling people about the demonstration next July, and we hope to bring some new energy to that demonstration from the people who will be arriving at Washington from their walk across the country. So I just want to say thank you very much to all of you who have been in this effort to rein in NATO longer than I have, and Veterans for Peace is going to do whatever we can. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, meanwhile, Zul is trying to write his questions down. So he says that there are two questions that we need to answer in a unified and convincing way if we are to get many people into the streets of DC next July. So the first question is why NATO undermines the United Nations. And the second question is you're still writing, but maybe, and you can already write why or say why NATO undermines the United Nations. What do you think? Well,
first, I would like to tag on to what Mike Ferner said about the Great Walk, the Great Peace Walk. Here is a book that was written back in the 1980s about the Great Peace March that happened, I think it was 1987, and it was an anti-nuke march, which certainly falls into what we're doing these days. So, you know, the history of all of these marches is really good. And this was followed on by, wait just a minute, let me get the other book. And one of our Veterans for Peace people, Sally Alice from Albuquerque, was on that first walk. She's in her 90s now. She was also on the next part of the peace walk, which was in Russia. And this was the the American Soviet walk. These two books are really, really fascinating. You know, and it was during the Cold War that this Soviet American walk took place also. So, you know, there are historical things we can grab onto about keeping peace in the forefront of people's minds as we walk, and I say the universal we walk across the United States. To Zul's questions, how does it undermine the United Nations? Well, we've certainly seen that part of the United Nations of the UN kind of rules of having to get UN resolutions for conducting war, which, you know, crazy. Well, the United States certainly did not get that during its war on Iraq back in 2003, and that's the reason, one of the reasons that I resigned from the U.S. government. You know, the whole issue of using, I mean, NATO is a war organization. It's a military organization, and that military organization does undercut what we hope is the mission of the United Nations, which is for peace and resolution of international issues in a peaceful manner rather than a military manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. But I think indeed it's interesting to see how maybe NATO is more and more replacing United Nations as a kind of global policeman for the world. And it's important discussion, I think, also to keep in mind, for taking with us eventually for the next counter summit we hopefully will have in Washington. Pipa.
But Ludo, to the truth,
Yeah.
we have also to say that there is an agreement between United Nations and NATO.
Yes, that's true.
About common activities and common events. So the United Nations also accepted NATO, which is, from my point of view, one of the biggest mistake of the United Nations, because NATO is absolutely the military concurrence or competition to NATO, but to the reality is that there is a strong cooperation, and NATO generals are located in New York at the UN headquarters and always discussing with the leadership of the United Nations about military activities.
Yeah, and of course the United Nations also partly dominated by the same powers in the Security Council with a veto power. 3 of the NATO countries have a veto power in Security Council. So I give the floor now to Pipa.
Thank you, Ludo. Right, well, first of all, I'd say I very much like the graphic that Anne held up on the second book, the Our Move graphic, which I thought was very strong. Because in a sense it is our move, and I would advocate for 3 clear points to enable understanding of why we have the position we have against NATO. Now, I'm not suggesting I have those points, but I have some ideas. And, the benefits of a multipolar world, most people across the population really don't know what you're talking about when you talk about a multipolar world. I've explained that so many times. Are we calling for the abolition of NATO? I think we need to be clear whether we want to rein it in or abolish it, and how that applies to our very big yes to life on Earth. Thank you. And just to add, whenever I'm in one of these groups, I feel I'm home. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Pipa. Okay, Tord?
Thank you, Tor Björk from Sweden and Friends of the Earth, also IPB. This is really a very important meeting and timely meeting. As Kate Hudson said, we live in a very specific situation where humanity can extinguish itself for the first time in history, more or less, either through nuclear war or through climate warming of the planet. This, I would say, gives us also chances to start to really get involved with other movements. And one option is the World Social Forum in Nepal in February next year. And as a contribution to that, we will organize a webinar next Saturday on the 7th of October. I put information about it in the chat. And here we see the possibility to really start to see that NATO is not a security organization anymore. They are pushing very much themselves as an environmental organization. And there are even climate activists now thinking that as NATO is much more strong, their demands for setting new standards for energy efficiency, etc., will be more effective than other ways. They are really gaining ground at the same time as they also have a policy saying stability is everything, and stability can only be created by cooperation between business, civil society, and states. And everyone threatening that stability is a foreign agent who has to be oppressed. This has not the peace movement really understood yet, and no other movements either. But we are all now under threat of NATO if we are against privatization. So it's not at all anymore a normal security issue. It's domestic policies totally connected with foreign policy. So I think this is very important steps forward. Thank you very much for organizing this. And I hope to see you next Saturday as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tor. Now the floor is for Tyler. Tyler Lyons.
Yeah, so I can't speak for outside of the US, but from my experience, people are convinced that NATO is a voluntary alliance, which we know is not true. That is, that brings in willing sovereign countries. Do we, for this movement, are we going to address how the US pushes regime change in order to expand NATO?
Okay, it's a question. We can discuss this in the few minutes that is left by those who want. Maybe first Bernie.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Thank you very much. Good to see some friends here, I know already. I'm in London, as I imagine Kate is. So greetings from the seat of freedom and democracy here in the UK. I've got a question. This is for anyone, okay? This question, anyone. I'm not addressing this to any particular person, but I might be wrong in what I'm saying. So I'm not saying that what I'm saying here is gospel, all right? But it appears to me that if I dare call it a proxy war, am I allowed to call it a proxy war in Ukraine? Maybe I'm not, I don't know. But the massive amounts of money that have been thrown at this proxy war in Ukraine, I've been watching for what it's worth, I've been watching the news here in the UK about a possible shutdown of the US government. Whether this is true or not, I don't know, but this is what we've been getting on the wonderful BBC. And so my question is this. This paper tiger of NATO, how are they going to be able to carry on throwing money at this when we have a situation emerging with BRICS, ASEAN, Association of East Asian Nations, the Shanghai Cooperation Organ, many other bodies on the eastern side of things, who have actually becoming adept at building their own financial architecture and freeing themselves from the yoke of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. South American countries are queuing up to join BRICS. And so we have a situation where we've got East and West again. You've got this Eastern emerging new paradigm, and we've got the old obsolete, defunct Western hegemon, which is holding on for dear life and threatening all our lives in the process. So two questions here. Can the USA sustain this financial hemorrhaging, all right? And secondly, how can we get the East and West to talk to each other? And we can't have two. We can talk about a multipolar world, but we're going to still end up with two poles, all right? East and West. We need to get these people talking, and we need to get somebody in the US government talking to Vladimir Putin, rather than just calling him the devil incarnate and Hitler on whatever, on steroids, all right? So those are my questions. They might be a little bit provocative, but that's not too bad. So I'm going to stop there. If anybody wants to address those, the financial situation for the US, considering what's going on actually domestically, the domestic problem in the US is just going haywire. And of course, this East-West rapprochement. We want rapprochement. We want talk, dialogue. So I put it to you. I throw it at you now. Anybody?
Okay, I think I'll address some of Bernie's questions. One, I think, you're talking about, on the one hand, the multipolarity and the other side of this bipolar choice. The reality is that multipolarity means, on the one side, of course, there is the West, which wants to continue with its dominance, hegemony, empire, the collective West. It's a small, there are just a few states. So it's one pole, and they want a unipolar, they want to continue with what they call the unipolar moment and system. Russia and China challenge, and they have this counter-hegemonic position where they want to challenge this unipolar position. But there is what we call the third lot, and that is the neutral states, the non-aligned states, the Asians, the Latin Americans, the Africans. Now, they're neither fully on the side, of course, they're not on the side of the unipolar system, nor are they sort of full allies of either China or Russia. They want what they call strategic autonomy. They want their independence. They want their financial and economic and political autonomy. They've already had hundreds of years of colonialism and neocolonialism. So they don't want any more of that, and therefore they're looking for this multipolar system. Now, Russia and China are also arguing for a multipolar system, and what especially the third world and the global south, as we call it, argues is that we are not opposed, we're not against the West. We want to work in a system of kind of peaceful coexistence, and you have to engage with us. But the global south has never been hegemonic, so its voice is never heard. It's not there on the major multilateral institutions, whether it's the Security Council or the voting blocs of the IMF or the WTO or the World Bank, etc. So they keep issuing statements, and that's one of the reasons that BRICS came up, because these are the more powerful amongst the global south. And they continuously say that they're not against the West, and they don't want to have any kind of war with Russia or China either. They want to use both sides. Russia or China have never colonized them. China was a third world country till just a few years ago. So don't demonize any of them, and do talk. So their conclusion is like what you're saying. As far as the financial issue is concerned, the US, it keeps printing dollars, and it has that privilege of the dollar being the world's strategic reserve. And therefore, that issue of inflation is their own issue. No one can do anything about it. But there is a dollar hegemony, which is the material base of this unipolar system. And that is why they're able to intervene effectively, not only militarily, but also economically in other countries. So what many countries, especially the more powerful countries in the global south, are now doing, and what Russia and China are also doing on their own, is that they're now doing trading in their own national currencies. So Russia and China are trading oil in yuan and ruble. India is buying Russian oil with ruble and rupees. And we have a swap arrangement with almost all ASEAN countries, and even with Qatar, in which we are using rupees and dirhams. But this is just about 5% of the trade trade. The dollar hegemony continues and will continue to be the strongest. But there is going to be a rise of these multiple currencies and use of national currencies also, which is part of this multipolarity, and that's where I'll stop.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you, Anu. Time is running, so we have maybe a few minutes left for the last three now interventions or maybe contributions to the questions or answering the questions. Kate, please.
Thanks, Ludo. Yeah, very interesting discussion here. Just a couple of quick points. One which kind of a bit merges what Tyler was saying, also what Bernie was referring to around the question of sovereignty of NATO states, but also the financial issue. So one of the big things that we focused on here is the NATO demand that NATO states spend 2% of GDP on the military, and that's saying to those countries, this is 2%, which is actually, quite a lot, that can't be spent on public services, healthcare, education, housing, and all that sort of thing. It has to be spent on war fighting. And in actual fact, in Europe, there are very few of the NATO states, this is Europe is kind of developed, whatever, economically developed. Very few of them actually meet that target, so it's a financial burden, particularly on those countries that have joined relatively recently from Central and Eastern Europe, particularly when they were all expected pretty much on joining to junk their previous military arsenals, weaponry and all that, tech, and bring it in line with those of the other NATO states. In other words, having to buy new military kit from the US, from UK and so on. So it's a massive military imposition on those countries. And not surprisingly, although, I know Trump and all that were always saying that NATO states expect the US to pay for it all and, all that kind of thing. In actual fact, over here, we see it as we are made to pay for the US wars, and pursuing the US foreign policy. So that's one aspect of it. And I suppose the other thing is about the US economy. I mean, Bernie, you're talking as if it's kind of on the verge of collapse, but I don't know what the exact situation is, but I read the Financial Times over here, as you may well do, and there are a lot of articles about, irrespective of varying indicators, the strength of the US economy and the shift towards, away from neoliberal market-orientated stuff and towards massive government investment and government expenditure on US industry and so on. So I'd be interested to know, well, we probably don't have time to go into that now, but I think it's more complex than that. And I wouldn't agree that Western hegemony is defunct. There's a long way to go, in which, as I said at the start, we may well be pulled down before it is finally defunct. And then finally, it's not just West-East, is it? I mean, Andy's just gone into this, so, but there is the South, which is, I mean, from my point of view as a anti-nuclear activist, the leadership of the global South in anti-nuclear stuff, TPNW and all that, it's second to none, so let's not just see East and West, this is the South. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Hey, Ludo, could I just make one comment?
Yes, go ahead.
At midnight tonight, probably the US government will shut down, which may cause cheers around the world. Of course, for those who kind of depend a little bit on government stuff. Anyway, it's the annual US government shutdown. Thank you.
But it means that the wages won't be paid, if I well understood, included from the military. Okay, Joe.
Yeah, hello everyone. Really happy we have a great big meeting today. I think it bodes well for what we can do in DC in July. Just 2 points. Someone raised the idea of the anti-nuclear movement and trying to, the climate change movement and trying to bring them together. And I think that's a really important idea that we should spend some time on, not necessarily today, but in the lead up into July. I mean, as you may know, with the General Assembly meeting that took place at the UN in New York, we had a march of 75,000 people for climate change. And we had a good anti-militarism contingent as part of that. So I think it would bode us really well to reach out in a very serious way and try to bring the climate change folks into whatever we're planning for July. The other thing I just wanted to say about multipolar and so forth, I think one of the things it really does, whether or not one pole or two poles are going to be good or two bad poles for the world or whatever, it has given some space to people in the global south to do things that they didn't feel comfortable doing before because they had to stand up to the World Bank and the IMF and the United States and NATO and the hundreds, if not thousands, if not thousand military U.S. bases around the world. And we saw this in a couple of ways, I think, recently. I think some of the anti-French coups and movements that have been taking place in Africa, I think people felt that they could do that they could exert their own authority because there was someone else to look to, in the world in terms of economic relations and trade and even military support. And the other thing was just looking at what happened in the General Assembly this year when Zelensky spoke there. 2/3 of the General Assembly left the floor. They didn't listen to his talk. Last year, it was packed. And I think the reason is, despite the arm twisting of the United States, they felt comfortable doing that. They felt they could do that they could advocate for the first time for their own needs. And I think that's some important aspect to think about in terms of this new kind of global reality or multipolar world or challenges to U.S. hegemony. I think all of those are very important, and we should understand that as we go forward with the movement against NATO. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Joe. We have Jake.
Hi there. Thanks for inviting us. I really do appreciate it. I think getting like-minded organizations talking about finding peace is so important. For the organization that I'm representing, the United Jewish People's Fraternal Order, we see it vitally important that we try to do our best to not expand NATO and to disband it, especially given its history rooted in fascism. And I hope that as an organization, as all of us kind of coalesce together, we create that kind of education to talk about that. Here in the United States, I think people see NATO as a protector, but they don't understand its roots in fascism that lead to wars like what we had to go through in World War II. And just recently, we just had like the Canadian Parliament put in some, basically a Nazi that they just invited him in as if they didn't want to vet him. Well, they obviously did vet him, and they probably did that for that reason. And so I find it very alarming, and I hope as an organization together, all of us, that we address the rise of fascism connected to NATO. And that's all. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jake. Before we finish, there was one question also in the chat box. Morwena, you wanted to ask a question, but short, please. Then we will end this first session. Morwena?
Do you have,
okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah, do you do any minutes? Because it's just important for you to discuss these things, and then, you've made really good points, and I'm just wondering how you manage to get this across to other people. And, like Jake said, it needs to be educated to, you have to go out and look for this information in simple terms and have a conversation about this to general people. It's quite difficult, really. I don't think many people know, we've got all the other media that's it really, to fight against. So I just wonder how you get all these information out.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Morwena. I think this is exactly the kind of questions we would like to address in the second session, because that's about how to organize and also how to mobilize and how to convince people, I think. So I give back to Christina.
Okay. Then I try to Yes, thank you, Ludo, very much for the moderation of this part. And we are coming now to the second part, where we would like to discuss what we want to organize in Washington. And we will have an introduction by David Swanson and Rainer Braun. And we would like to ask Medea if she makes a moderation. And for this, I will hand over to Medea.
Yes, thank you so much, Christine. And it's been a great discussion so far. Wonderful to see that we are organizing with so much time in advance. And I remember the last time that NATO was being hosted in the United States was back in 2012. And we did get thousands of people out on the street. It was a different time. It was right in the midst of the Occupy movement that brought a lot of people, particularly young people, into activism. The US and NATO countries were very involved in the war in Afghanistan, the US in Iraq. And so there was a very vibrant veterans movement, not only Veterans for Peace, but Iraq and Afghanistan veterans against the war. And it was a time of Obama's re-election campaign, and his headquarters was in Washington, D.C. And there was also a very unpopular mayor in Chicago. So we managed to get people who had done nothing with NATO before to get very interested and involved. And it was a very exciting time. Now, doing this in Washington, D.C. is very different. We don't have that kind of feisty activist community. There is a lot of division in the very small peace movement that exists now and divided around the war in Ukraine. But we do have election season coming up and presidential candidates who are talking about this issue. As other people pointed out, there is a vibrant environmental movement that we must work with. So there are a lot of difficulties and a lot of opportunities. So I look forward to hearing from our two speakers and then having a lively discussion about it. So we're going to start out with David Swanson, who is the executive director of World Beyond War. He is a prolific writer of books and articles. He hosts a wonderful radio show called World Talk Radio. And David is somebody who you wonder, are there like 4 or 5 or 6 David Swansons, because he does so much as one person. But we're really glad you're part of this peace movement, David. So please go ahead.
Same to you, Medea. I don't know if this is supposed to be 2 minutes or an hour, so just shut me up when ready. We have had about a dozen or so of us do a handful of Zoom calls over recent weeks and months, putting together plans, or at least plans to make plans. Nothing is carved in marble yet, but we have put a website with some basic ideas at NoNatoYesPeace.org. We have talked about focusing major efforts on public turnout for the weekend, because a lot of people work when it's not the weekend. A lot of people work even when it is. The weekend being the 6th and 7th, so somewhat of a pro-war but long weekend, vacation weekend in the United States because of July 4th being the previous Thursday, the Yay for U.S. Nationalism and Wars Day. And then the actual NATO meetings don't start until the next Tuesday. So we want to plan events in the week leading up and in the week following that weekend during the actual NATO summit. But tentatively, what we've started thinking is to have a big conference on Saturday, the 6th, and a big rally in front of the White House on Sunday, the 7th, and then other events to be added. We have not entertained any doubt that we wanted to abolish NATO. So I heard earlier on this call, do we want to fully abolish it? Excuse me, fuck yes, I think is the answer. So abolish NATO and support peace. That's the agenda we've talked about. And we've sort of negotiated the decision not to negotiate anything else, to try to say almost nothing other than no to NATO, yes to peace, in order, because I think a lot of people from Europe would be surprised at the things you can say that will alienate and exclude various organizations in the United States. And we want to include every possible organization. Although obviously when we have a conference and we have a rally, people are going to say things. The 24-hour peace wave is something we haven't talked about when to do it, but if I am personally involved in both this and that, I would much prefer we did it the previous week, like the end of June. But, you know, whenever works. We have applied, one of our number of Veteran for Peace activists in DC, Mike Marceau, has applied for a permit for several hours, well, from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. On Sunday for Lafayette Park in front of the White House. And he tells me that they won't swear the permit is good until shortly before the event, but we can go ahead and act as if the permit is good. We are not talking about a 6-hour rally. We're talking about a rally in that space with time to set up and time to take down. The website NoNATOYesPeace.org needs info, links, resources, books, articles, graphics, videos, anything you can send me that we can provide to people to answer these questions of how do we persuade the public, how do we bring people in, how do we unite with the climate movement, etc. It also has a place to sign up as an individual that you want to be informed about these events in July, and to endorse as an organization. These need not be U.S. organizations, and they need not be peace organizations, any organizations. It also has, you also can take that form that's on that website and embed it on your own website or any other website. I'm gonna make that clearer on the website, that you can just copy the code and put it on any website in the world. It also has a link to a website that isn't really created yet for that walk that Mike Ferner mentioned earlier, that because we've started talking about this so early, friends of ours have decided to have a walk start in January and arrive on the 6th of July in Washington, D.C., which will be great because we can encourage people to do the whole walk or part of it or just the end of it and arrive in large numbers to the events in D.C. It also has a music video with Ben Grosskopf's song for No to NATO that we've used at previous events, including 2019 when NATO was in DC. And he has, of course, agreed to, if we want him to be part of these events in July and to sing that song. So we're going to have another planning call on the 9th of October. You can contact me at david@davidswanson.org if you want to be part of these planning calls between now and July. We have a number of committees set up and we need more people on them and we need more of them. We have an outreach committee. We have a housing/camping committee. We plan to give people advice on, where to find good and cheap housing. And we plan to have a board where people can offer housing and accept housing. We're interested in the possibility of doing a large group rental at some discount of lots of rooms in one hotel. So what we need to know from all of you is what you want, what you're interested in, what you would participate in. So again, david@davidswanson.org. We have a venues committee figuring out where to have the conference, where to have the rally, although the rally is, the White House, we think. A media committee, which includes addressing this whole question of how we build up to this between now and then. A music committee. We're talking about trying to get as big name musicians as we can to be part of the rally, to bring in more people and excitement. A conflict resolution committee. We expect trouble and we want to be prepared for it. And I think we need more committees, including we need committees to plan the contents of this conference and of this rally, whether topics like climate will be included, what topics, what speakers, etc. We have a Google Drive, Google folders with planning docs on all of this that anybody who gets involved can be given access to. But this is very initial stages. You know, we're looking into all the different venues and housing possibilities, but we need more people, and we need to get to work on this. But we're off to a good start. So hope that answers some questions.
Wonderful. Perfect. Thank you so much, David. And now we're going to go to our second speaker here, Rainer Braun, who was the previous executive director of Peace Bureau International. And in his quote retirement, I think he is probably at least, if not more, active than before. In fact, he was one of the key people that brought representatives from 32 countries together this summer in Vienna to try to build a stronger movement against the war in Ukraine. So we are very, very lucky to have Rainer Braun as part of this peace movement. Rainer, please go ahead.
Thank you, Medea, for the invitation, and thanks for the nice and polite words in the beginning. You know, I think David was showing us how deep and how strong the preparation is in the United States. And I think this is really a great sign that in this early stage of the preparation, so many people and so many organizations are engaged, and I'm quite sure that more will join. And I think the ideas with the counter summit, with the demonstration, with the rally, with the camp, they are brilliant. So I don't want to speak about that. I would like to mention 3 international activities and maybe 2 points which in general are useful for our preparation. I think we need 1 international activities which combined the anti-NATO protests all over the world. And I would like to underline that for me, the best action would be, again, that we are organizing a peace wave around the world, where the protests against NATO from all parts of the world will be shown by videos, by film clips, by actions on the street, whatever people are doing in the different parts of the world. And it must be very strong with the Asian support, and we also should try to engage groups in Africa, showing that that NATO is also present in different places in Asia. So this is for me 1 very important point. The second important point, I think we need something like a week of action against NATO around the summit in Washington, where in all parts of the world, we are organizing different activities, from demonstrations about smaller actions in the rooms, in the different cities, where we are putting together our protests against NATO. I think these 2 points are really very important. But what is our biggest problem? Our biggest problem is that our bubble knows why we are against NATO. But in the broader society, it is quite unknown, or even NATO is well accepted. And I think a campaign of awareness raising why NATO is definitely the opposition of peace is a very important part. And I think we should think about an online and an offline campaign, our arguments against NATO, to spread them in the broader society, not only to have them in our anti-NATO bubble. I think this is a very important point, to convince more people in more parts of the world, in more organizations. You know, even in the peace movement, we are not unified against NATO. We have organizations in the peace movement which are doing a great job against nuclear weapons, which are more or less in favor or neutral against NATO. So such an awareness-raising information campaign seems to me a very important part of the preparation of the summit. This includes for me, and you know, when you are looking through the emails we are getting, that we are starting with a webinar series where we discuss specific points of NATO. Maybe the point, what is global NATO? What is NATO doing in the Arctic and Antarctic? What is NATO doing in South Africa, in South America, or even in Africa with the new military bases? So such an information an awareness raising campaign where we inform about the NATO could be a good part of the preparation for discussing this. And maybe as a last idea, maybe, and Medea, you have a lot of experience in this, we can, at the first day of the NATO summit, maybe we can have a one-page ad in one of the central US newspapers. Headline is 75 years is enough, no to NATO or something like that, and have a huge ad with maybe 5,000 signatures all around the world, which everyone is supporting a little bit with the payment for such an ad, so that everyone who is coming to the summit and take a newspaper in his or her hands must see our ad. Maybe this could also combine activities all around the world. So my key point is that we need more thoughts for preparing the actions, but we also need more thoughts and more ideas for delegitimize NATO, which means to reduce the influence of NATO in the broader society and the broader public. And when we are using the time from now till to the event, I think we can go steps forward in the delegitimization of NATO. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent points, both of you, and very inspiring. I think, of course, a big unknown is what's going to be happening about Ukraine at that time. But you both raised the importance of awareness. I love the idea for an ad, a big one in the Washington Post, the global actions, and then actions, big ones in the US. So now we have a chance for discussion. If you could either put your hand raise under the reactions up, or just put up your hand and I'll recognize you. And right now, and what we'd like is for people to give us ideas of what other things we could be doing, or reactions to what you've heard David and Reiner say. So Christine.
Yeah, thank you to give me the floor. First, I must say something to Reiner. You introduce him, of course, with his last activities, but Reiner Braun is also a founding member of the NATO network and member of the ICC. And the international network, of course, support the activities, and are organizing a lot of these proposals he told us, and what to do. And the second point, all what David said about the website, it's really a good tool, and there's also possibilities to include it in the NATO web page. And I have already linked it to this one, so that both sites are useful, one with the main point in United States, and the other with the all other activities, especially those proposed by Reiner Braun. And I can put it again in the chat, so you can save it and can look. And also we have a peace calendar on the NATO website with international peace events, and there we also have to include preparation events before the summit, and come to a really week of actions around the activities in Washington. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And in the chat, I see Ludo has put a link to a video, everything you didn't know about NATO. Looks wonderful. And Ludo, you might want to, during this time, tell us about your book updates and how we might use that. Anna, we'll go to you.
Thank you. Anna Georgi in Western Mass. And when I lived in Germany, I was involved in the 2009 demonstrations. So I'm happy to be back. We're so polarized in this country that because Trump spoke against NATO, and the Republicans against funding the Ukraine war, the peace movement needs to really be out in the public with very clear analysis. And we really need a bunch of articles that because of the short attention span and the amount of material that comes to people, it would be great to have articles like in Common Dreams, as well as op-eds, and that can be put in local papers. And that would be great. And Medea, you might think of your next book, because your amazing put-togethers in the past have been great. But something like that would be very helpful, because you've got the knowledge, with worldwide on this, and so some kind of edited book that's very clear would be great. Thank you.
Wonderful, great suggestions. I think we have Bernie.
Thank you, Medea, my dear. This is for Anne, okay? I'm talking about extraterritorial overreach here. As we all know, the USA's got thousands of miles of ocean on either side, the Pacific and the Atlantic. And so what's the fuss about national security? And in particular, with the, can you see a tie-up between AFRICOM and Southcom, this NATO thing, and the activities of Laura Richardson in Latin America? So over to you, Anne.
Well, so we'll wait for Anne to think about that one.
Okay, right, yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
Great.
meanwhile, we'll take these two more, Tyler and Robert, and then we'll hear responses from Reiner, David, and Anne. Tyler?
Yeah, so one thing I've been seeing a lack of in some of the peace rallies is the presence of trade unions. I believe we need to do more outreach into these unions, since they have the power, the leverage to shut down the whole country and if our needs are not met. I mean, most people are aware that that cities are in decline, that they're decaying, but yet we still spend billions of dollars on the military-industrial complex. I think getting the unions involved is a necessity.
Excellent point, and we'll ask our speakers to address that. Robert, we'll take your question and then go for some answers, then we'll have another round of questions. Robert, you want to unmute? Yeah.
I'm with the American Peace Information Center. We're a relatively new, recent creation in the peace movement. And we've been calling attention to the influence of Nazi parties and Nazi organizations within the Ukraine involved in the war. And I think bringing this to people's attention is extremely urgent and necessary. There's also been desecration of Jewish Holocaust graves in Ukraine in the past year. And this is as it were, an angle on the Ukraine situation, the NATO situation. The NATO is actively supporting fascist and Nazi organizations in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And it's really like history repeated, except this time it seems that our country's on the wrong side. We have an attempt by Nazi organizations in Ukraine to break up Russia. And so this is outrageous. And, it's the kind of thing that a lot of people would get really upset about if they saw the Nazi flag and the people marching with torchlights processions in Kiev and the soldiers with the Nazi insignia on their uniforms, including Poroshenko. When he goes down to visit the troops, he has a Nazi insignia on his military jacket. So,
and including what happened in Canada just now with
not to mention that, our neighbors.
So okay, we get it, Robert. Thank you very much for that. And we'll let our speakers respond to whichever of those they'd like to. And let's start with David.
Well, I agree with everything just said and that has been said here. I wanted to recommend, I'm going to write a review of it very soon after I finish reading it, but that people get this book called NATO-Politanism, because it seems to be a very good history of NATO, though maybe not perfect. I think that was that a question, or are people just not muted?
I think they're just not muted.
Okay. Though I think that book can be well augmented by Andrew Coburn's book of a couple years ago called The Spoils of War, which I think is so good about the motivation of weapons profits, which I think, like Nazism, is maybe not in exactly the same way, is something that people are not happy to cheer for foreign policy set by weapons profits. I do think that we are doing this in a time where the propaganda is worse than it has ever been. The anti-Russian propaganda in the United States and the war as a public service, philanthropic, global good, that, spend 2%, spend as much of your economy on war as you can manage, not as that can be justified by some excuse. And this is what we're up against. And even worse is the political situation, where in an election year, which in the United States is about a 2-year period, you cannot say anything without it being interpreted as in favor of or against some candidate for the throne in the White House. And so we will have to spend half our efforts trying to communicate that we're not a rally for some presidential candidate. That's just the way it is. I do think it would be wonderful to have labor unions and every other group under the sun organizing this with us and putting their resources into it. It's worth informing, if anyone doesn't know the United States, it's worth informing people from civilized countries that labor unions don't support peace in the United States. And so where you have peace movements in places like Italy and even in Canada to some tiny degree funded by labor unions, we need to get all of those groups from all of those countries involved in this. We need all the NATO members and partners and the rest of the world involved in this. But we're not going to get the AFL-CIO to oppose war. And I think the positive side of all of this is that this war, unless it goes nuclear, is going to continue and get worse, and public opinion is going to continue to move against it. And as we continue to talk about it as World War I, but with nukes and climate collapse, people are increasingly going to understand that no matter what fantasies they believed about justifying the start of this war, the war in Ukraine, they want to end it. And we want to end it, and the people who don't want to end it have no good reasons. So I'm not trying to suggest all is hopeless. I think this could be a moment for winning over a lot of people.
Excellent. Reiner, do you want to respond?
Yeah, let me start with a suggestion to Ludo and you. Maybe we really should think to prepare a common book from both sides of the Atlantic, putting together the history, the actual development of NATO, the global NATO, and also the alternatives to NATO and the actions of the peace movement against NATO as our gift to the 75th years anniversary. I think this would create also some attention, and it brings also together the different movements around the world which can show their activities against NATO. I think the second point I really would like to mention is a discussion about Ukraine and NATO. I think this will be a key point of the next summit. And I think we should definitely put our point that Ukraine never should become a member of NATO. It should be a neutral country in a process of ceasefire negotiation for find a peace solution. For Ukraine, to send more weapons is definitely the wrong way. To enlarge the sanctions is the wrong way. I think this is also a key point where we can show the opposition to NATO, but also the need of demilitarization of Europe and demilitarization of policy in general, because it is not only the US and which is creating imperial politics. So I think we should discuss this in the preparation of NATO. Third point, I think a key point, it was mentioned several times, is the question of military budget and the military budget of NATO. 65% of the whole worldwide military budget is coming from NATO. And, we see more and more people becoming poor. the industry in the countries, above all in my country, is more and more destroyed. We are destroying the background of our wealth. And what we should do is to say, what we need is disarmament. We need disarmament for putting again the sustainable development goals on the international agenda. Who can we solve the climate problem when we don't go for disarmament? Who should pay for the climate fund? And. I think these are convincing arguments for broader parts of the society. So I'm really think that we put this question of military budget and the militarization of countries destroys economy and welfare, that we should put this much more in the point of our work. Trade unions, very difficult. But I think the same way it is difficult to get the support of the churches on the top. But we should best to do. When we can't get the leadership of the trade unions, we should go to the shop stewards, we should go to the local and national groups of the trade unions. I think it is very, very important. And now I'm using traditional work to get much more support from the working class for our activities. I think this is the key element of enlarging and broadening the peace movement. And I think many thoughts are needed how we can do this, with whom we can do this. And that is also the reason I have to leave now the meeting, because we have tomorrow a conference on Ukraine and ceasefire together with important parts of the trade unions discussing these points. And I have to go to a short other meeting for the final preparation. So excuse that I have to leave now, but thank you so much, Medea, for organizing this. I think we put together the thoughts, and I think we will have a continuation of our discussion during the next weeks and months. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rainer, for all of your great work. And we look forward to working with you to really build something very strong. We have a question still on the table from Bernie to Anne. Anne, did you want to answer that?
Sure. Well, Southcom, the Southern Command of the United States, and AFRICOM, the Africa Command of the United States, are unified commands, just as the Indo-Pacific Command is for the Pacific out to India. And all of these commands organize a huge number of military war games in the geographic region that they are assigned. And they do bring in NATO countries to be a part of these US-led exercises or war games. So it is quite appropriate that we include them in any discussions we have. Right now, there is a week of action to oppose AFRICOM that's primarily organized by the Black Alliance for Peace. Yes, working on being more knowledgeable about what goes on in Latin America as well as Africa in the name of the US as well as NATO is really important. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Anne. So I see we have two hands up. Mike and Nancy, I think we can take those, get David to answer, respond to those, and then we'll pass it back to Christina to close up for us. So Mike, go ahead.
Thank you, Medea. In regards to labor's involvement, I just wanted to mention that obviously it's important. We all agree on that. But David made a good point that labor in the United States is it's extremely difficult to get them to come out for peace. There was a very active formulation called U.S. Labor Against War that actually got the AFL-CIO to come out against the Iraq War, which was huge. And that took several years of organizing from the local unions on up. And I don't want to sound too hopeful at this point, but the person who was the coordinator of that effort, U.S. Labor Against the War, Michael Eisenschur, has just joined with a Veterans for Peace member to begin a new effort to involve labor with peace issues and using the angle of the climate crisis and the money that's going to war that could be used for, all of the jobs and everything that we always associate with alternative energy production. So Michael's involved with that. He also headed up U.S. Labor Against the War, and they did a fantastic job getting the AFL-CIO involved. So there is at least the network of contacts that Michael had with U.S. Labor Against War still exists. That's been some time ago, so we don't know how successful it will be pulling that back together. So we really do need the involvement of labor unions from around the world to hopefully pull U.S. labor into this a little bit more as well. But obviously it's important, and I think we all recognize that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mike. That's good news about Michael Eisenschur's new venture. And we have Nancy Price.
Yes, I just wanted to remind everybody that upcoming late November into early December is COP28 in the United Arab Emirates. And so that's a good opportunity to bring together the climate movement and militarism, I think. There was a contingent last year in Egypt that was fairly strong, but we need many more people involved in that this year. Thank you.
Excellent. David, did you want to respond to anything or just any final words?
Medea, maybe we should give Todd shortly the floor.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Yeah.
David, the final words.
Okay, sure. Shortly. Thank you. Todd.
Sorry.
Yes, this debate is very important, and I think we have two problems. One is to focus on a common denominator, the lowest, which maybe not convinced anyone, or the other one, we get trapped in too many details and in such a way that we are not able to reach out broadly. We have to make the options clear. I think the concept global NATO, I think, is very interesting because it is not really super radical. It doesn't say NATO is the bullshit. It says global NATO is bullshit. I think this is useful in the present conjuncture when NATO is really trying to become global, and a success will be if we're really reaching out globally. I don't think we lose much in spite of it's not very radical. I think we will win those who get a bit worried. Well, NATO, I thought that was good, but I don't like a global NATO. Second, we have to avoid a little bit ideological things. There are right-wing extremists also on the other side in Ukraine. It's not only on the Ukrainian side. So one have to be a bit careful with ideological things. That doesn't mean that it's unimportant. But as Rainer said, the economic aspects here are really the key issue. Fridays for Future have been, some of them have been saying in empty NATO demonstrations in Sweden, there's no climate justice with NATO. And I see in Sweden also a big consensus agreements that first they say, some say, we have to have consensus. And if you say disarmament in this climate statement, you are pro-Putin. But finally, a church pastor, a priest, women priest, said, God heaven, I will not sign anything if you don't say at least disarmament. And the decision was finally in consensus, disarmament. There is a shift going on right now in the climate movement, and there should be some strong effort in putting that on the table as a key thing. Disarmament for welfare and environment. Thank you.
Excellent points. Thank you so much. We do have a letter that Peace in Ukraine wrote about the environmental impacts of this war, and we've gotten a number of environmental groups to sign on to that. If anybody's interested in working on that, you can send me a note. I'll put my email in the chat. I also put in the chat the event that Peace in Ukraine, Code Pink, Veterans for Peace, bunch of World Beyond War, others are having this Tuesday with the presidential candidate Cornel West on the urgency for peace in Ukraine. It'll be live streamed as well as in person in DC if you're interested. So David, we'll go to you.
Well, I agree with absolutely everything everybody has said, which is very strange. Something bizarre must be going on. I also recommend a video on environmental damage from the Ukraine war that Marcy from Code Pink made some weeks back. I also wanted to mention that when, again, in this book I'm just reading, when NATO was created, the discussion in the US government included the proposal, why don't we just apply the Monroe Doctrine to Europe? That would be simpler. And I think it wasn't done for two reasons. One, because the Monroe Doctrine, half of it that's been completely erased, was the United States will stay the hell out of Europe. And the other, because they just decided to do it through NATO. And so it's worth telling people that this December 2nd is 200 years of the Monroe Doctrine, and we're organizing events all over the world to bury the Monroe Doctrine. And you could bury NATO, the NATO Charter, in there with it, but bury the Monroe Doctrine is not as scary to your average television viewer as abolish NATO. Half of them have never heard of the Monroe Doctrine. So one idea for an event that people can do leading up to next July.
Okay, thank you, David, for your proposal with the Monroe Doctrine. This is, I think, very important also in Europe, and we should see what we can do together in remembrance and present this and use this for acting against global NATO. And NATO is global already. Nearly every country is affected because NATO has a lot of alliances. The Partnership for Peace is the most important and the biggest, but yet there's alliances around the Mediterranean with the Arabic countries. There is really acting globally, and this we have to educate the people, because it's not really well known, neither in Europe nor in America, nor in the United States, and also in Latin America, it's not really known, and they are affected a lot. So I hope I see you all in at least in Washington, but before David announced the next meeting, and the No to NATO network will also have beginning of October and next ICC meeting, where we prepare our activities in Europe. And of course, we have an exchange between both groups, to say it like this, and we have our websites where we can distribute all the information. Thank you very much for attending this and spread the information, and we will see us again.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Great
Thank
job,
you.
everyone.
Bye.